Is Chainsaw Man still worth reading? It doesn't seem that way considering the doom posts over the last few chapters, but it feels like most of these people saying Chainsaw Man fell off or they can't read Chainsaw Man anymore have kinda missed the point. Like, yeah, it's not great that Denji keeps finding toxic relationships, but this is exactly what he needs. When you consider everything that was established in part 1 and how he's grown together with Asa in part 2, this regular manipulation is kind of the perfect thing for Denji, because it's only making him a better character. Which is why, in this video, I'd like to review Denji's romantic history in Chainsaw Man, discuss how Asa ties into this as well as the core theme of Chainsaw Man, and explain why Chainsaw Man is actually better than ever. So first, let's make sure we're clear on what the problem is right now. And I do mean problem because Denji was clearly being built up for this big revelation, only to be horny on Nain like 2 seconds later. You don't have to be a big Chainsaw Man fan to know that the whole premise is that Denji is kind of being in to talk down to like a dog, which I guess isn't the worst thing in the world. Except the problem is that he's always entering into these power dynamics, where he's always being manipulated at his own expense, and it feels like Denji is constantly being traumatized. Recently, he came to the realization that this is a flaw of his, mainly because whenever he's hurting or he has something he needs to work through, he ignores his problems by chasing sex and looking for these kinds of manipulative relationships, where he doesn't have to think about anything. When he realized this, everyone got really excited because finally, after almost 200 chapters, Denji was going to learn his lesson. He was going to put himself first. He was going to focus on himself and stop getting hurt all the time. And this lasted for about 2 seconds before Yoru flirted by telling him to eat his own hand. And this is the problem with Chainsaw Man at the moment. Namely, Denji making progress towards breaking the cycle and learning from his mistakes, only to make the same mistake and go right back to square one. And there's really 2 reasons why people find this frustrating. First of all, by making the same mistake, it can feel like Denji isn't really learning anything. As a result, he can feel redundant, and that means he's not growing as a character. Like, there's tragic, and then there's just completely ignoring your mistakes. The other reason this can be frustrating is because whenever Denji gets manipulated by girls, a lot of fans will focus on the sexual element and be like, oh, Denji scored, and it's like, yeah, great, you completely missed the point of what Fujimoto was trying to say. Now, ironically, I would actually argue that the people who have a problem with Denji making these mistakes are missing the point as well, just in a different way. Because like I said, it's clearly a problem, but that doesn't mean Denji isn't growing. In fact, this is some of the best growth we've seen for Denji, and it's only going to get better because of Asa. But real quick, before I say anything else, make sure to become a channel member if you're enjoying the video. You get exclusive badges and emojis, and you can pick which series I cover next. But like I was saying, while Denji may feel redundant, you have to remember that this has been a major part of his character for almost 200 chapters. If you go all the way back to chapter 1, what was Denji's problem? He was traumatized by the death of his father. And so what does he do while he's depressed? He lets himself be manipulated by Makima. He then spends the rest of the manga figuring out what it means to be happy. First, he chases little impulses like jam and magazines, but then he decides sex will make him happy. So he makes a deal with power, but that doesn't make him happy. He gets a chance with Himeno, but that doesn't make him happy. In the process, he watches more and more people die, and he explains that he doesn't feel sad at their loss, suggesting that he's disassociating himself from any potential pain. It isn't until he meets Reze that Denji is in his first truly positive relationship. But even then, he was manipulated by Reze in the beginning, and he was willing to throw his life away to elope with her on a whim. Then after Aki dies and he watches Power get killed, Denji does what he always does. Instead of facing his problems head on, he gives the control and responsibility of his feelings to the person trying to manipulate him. So part 1 established this cycle, a cycle in which Denji is hurt, he realizes he's in deep pain, but then drowns out that pain by giving control of his life to someone who wants to manipulate him. This is why his relationship, if you can call it that, with Makima was the ultimate toxic relationship. Denji was being being used. But in a way, he was also using Makima because he wanted to be like a dog. He wanted someone to tell him what to do so that he didn't have to think about his pain anymore. And as we eventually find out, Makima was using Denji in a similar fashion. Denji explains that Makima probably never even knew who Denji really was, inferring that she only saw him as Chainsaw Man the whole time. Afterward, we learn from Pochita that Makima always wanted to form an equal relationship, but could only ever form relationships based on power and fear. So there's two takeaways here that not only wrap up part 1, but also tie into part 2. Because she only saw Denji as Chainsaw Man, this means that Makima was using Denji to fulfill a relationship that never existed in the first place, a fantasy. She was using Denji as a means to an unrealistic ideal. This also demonstrates that one of the core struggles in Chainsaw Man is the relationship between personal identity and the personas we display to others. This is why romance is such a big part of Chainsaw Man. Now, to that point you might say, okay, well, even if this was executed really well in part 1, it's just being recycled over and over in part 2. In other words, it's great that we could reach that point in part 1, but the fact that Denji keeps allowing himself to be manipulated means he hasn't learned from his mistakes, and he's not growing as a character. My first counter to this is that that's exactly the point. Denji is supposed to be a dumbass because this is a big problem for him and it's tied into his depression. So the more he experiences pain, the tighter he's going to hold on to this same habit. My other counter is even if Denji is being redundant, that's what we want. Because somehow getting murdered by Makima wasn't enough of a wake-up call. In fact, his response was to adopt the Chainsaw Man persona that the world created. So really all he did was jump from being manipulated by Makima to allowing society to dictate his identity for him, meaning he never learned his lesson and he needs to have everything break down before he can finally learn that lesson. And the only way to do that is to keep breaking him again and again. As a matter of fact, this is why the introduction of Asa was one of the best things to happen to Chainsaw Man, because really Asa is almost like the perfect blend of Denji and Makima. And here's what I mean. Asa also has trauma. As a result, she has a hard time expressing herself openly and is pretty clearly awkward in social situations. So in this sense, she is just like Denji, because while Denji can make friends, he's no stranger to trauma, and he doesn't exactly have the best track record when it comes to relationships. At the same time, Yoru makes Asa just like Makima, because what was Makima's flaw? She could only form relationships through power and fear, even though she wanted an equal relationship. And what have we seen happen to Asa whenever she tries to be romantic with Denji? Well, the first time she threatened to cut him with a knife, as Yoru. Later on, when Denji is crying, she kisses him, as Yoru. She's able to break away and confess that she lost people like Denji did, but then has to transform back to Yoru and put on a brave face. And then she goes back to Asa to admit that Chainsaw Man taught her that she still has something to live for. Then in chapters 192 and 193, she can only flirt with Denji by turning into Yoru and playing this power dynamic against him, forcing him to cry and telling him what to do. This is why Asa is like Denji and Makima. She's experienced trauma. She wants to share that trauma, but minus one exception, she's really only able to do that by playing out the Yoru persona and assuming control over Denji. And this is why we see her break the persona and go back to Asa in chapter 194. I'm recording this before chapter 195, but it seems pretty clear that she wants to break the cycle and finally be honest with Denji as herself and not this persona. So this is why the toxic romance we're seeing right now is actually perfect. It reminds us of the painful relationship between personas and romance. The trap of playing out a fake version of ourselves because we're too afraid to be vulnerable. Asa is afraid of being herself around Denji, and because of this obstacle, she has to resort to dealing with Denji as Yoru and creating this transactional relationship instead of being equals. Likewise, even though he gives away control, Denji isn't being any more vulnerable than Asa, because like he did with Makima, he's choosing to use Asa by letting himself be manipulated and avoiding the responsibility of facing his own problems. And this is why Asa and Denji are the perfect broken couple, because they both have major issues with personas and facing their problems honestly. So this is why we keep seeing these characters run into the same problems and making the same mistakes. because they keep relying on these personas, and so they're going to suffer the consequences again and again until they're both finally broken and they have nowhere to run anymore. So yeah, I get it. It can feel like Fujimoto is purposefully leaning on this crutch for the sake of shock value and answering to the lowest common denominator of fans. But really, he's building up to the breaking point where both Denji and Asa can finally break the cycle. That's why, even though everyone else might say Chainsaw Man is doomed, I think this could turn out even better than Chainsaw Man Part 1. But now I'd like to hear what you think. How would you describe the romance right now? What would you say is the problem with Chainsaw Man? Share your thoughts and see what everyone else has to say down in the comments. I'll pick my favorite and share it as comment of the week on my community tab. Also, don't forget to become a channel member. You'll get exclusive badges and emojis, you can pick which series I cover next, and you can even get your name in future videos. Also, check out my other Chainsaw Man videos, which you can find in the playlist linked right here. Until then, thank you for watching, and I hope to hear from you soon.